Done. Already off to a killer start. Welcome everyone to the Department of Community Health Sciences and O'Brien Institute for Public Health Seminar Series. Today's seminar will focus on building inclusive classrooms. And just please note that this presentation is being recorded. So before we get into the nitty-gritty, I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in Southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising of the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wellesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. I am grateful for the privilege of working, learning, and living in this beautiful place. So a focus on inclusion in higher education means a focus on fostering meaningful learning and academic success for all students. This is regardless of personal background, age, ability, or life circumstances. Inclusion in the classroom means new approaches that involve student-focused learning strategies and assessment approaches that create learning environments valuing diversity. I'm joined by a panel of 2 teaching faculty and a student who will share their experiences today and wisdom that they have through the many years of experience about creating inclusive environments for learning. So let me introduce our panel. Dr. Rebecca Haines-Saah is an associate professor in community health sciences. She's trained as a health sociologist, and her current projects include qualitative and policy-focused research on parent advocacy for drug policy reform in the context of Canada's opioid crisis, and on youth policy engagement for mental health promotion. Rebecca teaches MDCH 683, which is Intro to Qualitative Health Research, in the MDCH program. Hello, Rebecca. Thanks for being here. Dr. Alan Martino, give a wave, Alan, is a tenure track instructor who only recently joined Community Health Sciences and the Community Rehabilitation Disability Studies program July of this year. So welcome, Alan. Alan's main research interests are in the critical disability studies, gender and sexuality, feminist and critical disability studies theories, and qualitative and community-based research, particularly participatory and inclusive research methodologies. His doctoral research examined the romantic and sexual lives of adults with intellectual disabilities in Ontario. By putting into conversation theories from both the sociology of sexualities and the field of critical disability. Alan teaches in the CRDS program, where he's instructor for core 435, 591, and 594, and is also a co-instructor in the Bachelor of Health Science program in HSOC 408 this semester. Okay, and Joyce Singh is our student panelist. She is a recent graduate from the Bachelor of Health Sciences program with a Health and Society major. Her honors thesis was titled Exploring the Association Between Cesarean Delivery and Breastfeeding Difficulties in a Prospective Cohort, the Happy Baby Study. Joyce has always set her sights high. In 2008, she received the Governor General's Award for achieving her achievements as a student in grade 12. And then last year, she founded the Health and Society Scholars Club and received funding from CHS through their Student Idea Fund competition to hold a 1.5 virtual retreat for BHSC and CRDS students, encouraging them to invest in their personal growth and development. Joyce is currently a graduate student at the University of Calgary's Haskayne School of Business in the Master of Management program, and is hoping to leverage her skills from her undergraduate program while developing her business acumen. We were very fortunate to have Joyce in our program. I'm really excited to see the next milestones that she will reach. So thank you, Rebecca, Alan, and Joyce, for being here. So we're just gonna get right into it with the first question, which I'd like to direct to all 3 of our panelists. So what does an inclusive classroom mean to each of you? Maybe we can start with Rebecca.
Thank you. I think it's as simple as students bringing their whole selves to the classroom and being able to know that their safety and comfort and the ability to be themselves in the classroom. And that applies to any educational context from elementary up until post-secondary. And that also applies to instructors and course leaders as well, that when you show up, you're not just there as a content expert, you're there representing a history, in many cases, a history of privilege or a history of struggle to get into that position, and maybe an intersection of both of those things in different ways.
Thanks, Rebecca. Alan?
I think in my work, I tend to draw a lot on critical disability studies and the growing field of disability studies in education. And what the field really shows is how disability is located within inaccessible spaces and political acts and practices. So for me, I've always been very interested in the structural ways that disabled people are made invisible, unexpected, or excluded in education systems. So for me, inclusive classrooms are spaces that are welcoming, is spaces where students feel that they are part of, they can be a part of, spaces where we invite students to experience and navigate and participate in the best ways they can, and ways that feel comfortable to their own bodies and minds. A space where students feel supported, where they have a sense of belonging, an environment that is caring and supportive, a course that invites students, most importantly, to connect course material with their personal experiences and be able to bring those personal experiences into structural analysis, right? Like, how does our world shape our lives?
Thank you, Alan. And Joyce?
Thank you. It's such an honor to be part of this discussion today. And I would say, for me, an inclusive classroom would be one that provides equitable access and respects diversity, as was mentioned, and is a space where students feel safe to be honest and to share their perspectives. And this would mean that there is a level of comfort in that they're able to do so, but also finding that fine balance where there is also a little bit of discomfort about having certain discussions, because I think that with a little bit of discomfort, there is growth and there is learning that is to be had in that space. So yeah, a classroom that is accessible to students from different backgrounds and not making assumptions about what a student's lived experience was, their context and their needs. I think that oftentimes it's best to just ask the person what they need as opposed to making those assumptions.
Thank you, Joyce. Those are really important points. And I hear a real core theme of inclusion really meaning safety, the ability to be who you are, and that brings your history and experiences to the classroom. So from each of your perspectives, why is it important to be inclusive in a classroom, particularly like within this educational environment? What does that bring? I'd like to actually start with Joyce, who's our student panelist.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think from a personal perspective, as an immigrant, as a person of color, and as a member of a faith-based community, it's incredibly important for me when I'm coming into a classroom to know that my thoughts and my contributions are being respected, and that even if people don't necessarily agree with what I'm saying, that as long as we're having a respectful dialogue and able to provide constructive criticism when needed, that is happening in the classrooms. And I think that really comes down to respecting diversity and understanding that the classroom environment is what is opening doors for students in the future to continue to respect people from various backgrounds and identities in their future careers and in the ways that they interact in society.
Thank you, Joyce. So Alan and Rebecca, what would you like to add to that from the educator perspective? Alan, would you like to go first?
Yes, I can. To me, an inclusive classroom is a matter of social justice and disability justice. So for me, it's about appreciating and welcoming difference. One of the things that sometimes the ways that we treat difference is almost as though it's disruptive in a bad way. right? But I think that this difference is disruptive in productive ways. It challenges the ways we can engage with students, the ways we can use the classroom space, the way we can assign and assess people's work. So for me, that's extremely important. Also, to me, inclusive classroom is one that is intersectional and always takes an intersectional lens. Even myself, from my own lived experience as a openly disabled, queer, scholar of color, like I haven't seen myself represented in many of my classes as when I was a student. So for me, it's extremely important that every time when I'm trying to create a space is that I'm bringing that lens and I'm highlighting voices from the community, from scholarship that brings those voices and that validates the experiences of students that we have. One of the things that I really appreciate in an inclusive classroom too is when students are able to make those connections between their everyday lives and what is happening in the world. Like it's that feeling of it's not just about me or I'm not alone, right? It's like knowledge is a really transformative process, right? Where we're able to understand who we are and where we've been and our opportunities and life chances and really try to transform that. To me, is also about work, to turn difficult moments into teachable moments, I think, right? Doing critical work, doing, intersectional work requires tension. It requires some discomfort, but it also requires trust. It requires relationships between faculty and students, between students. So for me, it's about asking students to constantly stop and reflect and reflect critically on their assumptions, their positions, their lived experiences. That to me is what makes an inclusive classroom so important.
And Rebecca?
Yeah, I mean, I would just add to that and say that the text that most influenced me in starting my teaching career, and I taught in gender, race, sexuality, and social justice studies. So it was imperative to teach from and work from that intersectional pedagogical stance was Bell Hook's text, Teaching to Transgress. And that talks about classrooms as communities of resistance and equipping students with the tools to really transgress against racial, sexual, class, ability boundaries. And it's really builds on this Freirean concept of education as a practice of freedom. And I'm a white woman coming into this space, but someone who lives in a Black family, and identified with Bell Hook's work on this early on because she was a working class Black woman from the South in an elite Ivy League institution. So when we're creating these classrooms, we can work on these spaces, but I mean, you have to also have this awareness as educators, as students, that we come to institutions with the expectation of practices of freedom, but universities are institutions that really do uphold white supremacy, sexism, homophobia, ableism, and all of these structural inequities. So I think it is a real double consciousness that we bring as educators to our classrooms when we're trying to do this work.
Great, thank you. Thank you all for your thoughts on those, on that. So I think we can all agree that an inclusive learning environment is important because it brings a certain richness to the learning, and it allows students to really learn from their own vantage point, which is, allows them to be the drivers of their own path. So as educators, how can we go about this? To Alan and Rebecca, what are some strategies that you have used to foster inclusivity in your classrooms? And how can you assess whether your strategy or strategies are being successful?
Well, I could start. Again, I think I will go back to my first point around bringing your whole self authentically to the classroom in a way that's open about the challenges you've faced in your path, or alternatively, the privilege that has facilitated you to be where you are, and recognizing where students are at, and not adopting this role of this objective, neutral portal of expertise. And so building that relational context where you can have those conversations and that people feel supported. However, I would just add this caveat, and Alan, you could reflect on it too, is that when we bring these things, We also have to have clear boundaries because I found, especially as a woman, then that builds in a lot of assumptions that you're going to take on a caretaker role or a mothering role instead of a mentoring academic role. So, that's how I assess how things are going. If we're having open conversations, if there doesn't appear to be that conflict around it, if people feel free to share, if people are open, but we have clear boundaries in place about what we're doing in the classroom and the support that we're giving.
So Rebecca, I'm just going to probe you a little bit on that. How, when you are setting up kind of your classroom to be this way, do you start with a conversation right up front, or is this something that happens organically throughout, let's say, the term of the course?
I think it depends on the topic. When I have taught specifically in race, sexuality, social justice, and gender studies, we did an exercise with undergraduates where we kind of did an intersectional mapping of who we are on a page. So we would draw ourselves at a center and have, circles going outwards about from the micro to the macro structural positionings of who we are and how we got here. And I will put mine on the PowerPoint so people can see me. And you don't have to reveal intimate details. You can do it in such a way that you speak of this as categories. Mm-hmm. And then I ask students to give me their maps without their names. And, not the details that would automatically single them out if they're one of a kind in the classroom setting. And so then I get a sense of who's in the room and I can start building relationships from there. And that's really important when looking at the content. Like teaching to transgress also talks about that sort of democratic process of building your content and curriculum around who's in the room to making sure people feel represented and safe.
Thank you, Rebecca. Alan, what are some of the strategies you've used and how do you know when they're working?
Yeah, I've used a multitude of strategies, from the syllabus, the readings I assign, to the discussions and how that happens. So for example, one of the first things that I invite students to do is to think about the relationship to disability, the same way that I open and talk about my relationship to disability, right? I think it's important sometimes to invite students to welcome identities in the classroom, to welcome that openness and thoughtfulness into the class. One of the first things I do as well in my classes is to create a community agreement right from the start. How do we want to have discussions that are fruitful, also respectful and thoughtful? And the good thing about it is that when we co-produce those community agreements with students, we kind of hold each other accountable, right? So students have an ownership in that process too. So it's not just me, right, raising my hand when something happens or a teachable moment comes, but I think students themselves also engage in that process. And they can come from that place of compassion with their colleagues and their peers, right? That's one of the things that I also try to emphasize, as much as possible. But most importantly, one of the things that really excite me, it's also about thinking creatively about different ways that students can participate, engage, and share their ideas. So for example, they can express their ideas through different materials. Like I've had arts-based methods in my courses. So I had students who create sculptures, haikus, even a rap song, right? Like this is one way of demonstrating incredible knowledge and critical thinking about the course content that may not be able to be fully expressed through papers alone, right? So I always invite, students to think about and demonstrate the ways that they're thinking through multiple ways of doing it. But even in terms of the syllabus, right? I want to make sure that we're covering authors that are often marginalized in the curriculum, topics that are often marginalized in curriculum, materials that are often not considered to be credible or legitimate. But these are the materials that, for example, people with disabilities can be more likely to be producing. We're talking about podcasts, news articles, blog posts. Like there's so much richness to this kind of material too, and students need to be able to get access to that. Or the other thing too is even perspectives within our field, right? So for example, we always talk about Global South and disability studies, right? I want to invite students not only to think about what life is like on the other part of the world, but to think about what is their relationship to what is happening on the other part of the world. That to me is the most exciting. When students start seeing those connections with people that they will never meet, maybe in person, but they still exist and we are implicated in those lives. So the last thing I would say is about working with community, right? Bringing members of the community to the classroom. Like it's such a rich part of, sorts of lived experience and knowledge that I love to bring to the class, and students really appreciate, because it's not just words on papers or, blank individuals, but these are real lives, right? Real implications, real consequences. And just to the second point around the measure, I think there are things that cannot be measured, like hallway conversations when a student discloses to you that they have a disability. And for the first time, like they didn't feel like they had to prove that they're disabled enough to get an accommodation. Like to me, that cannot be measured. It's about advising students about the challenges of coming out as disabled or as queer in a space that, as Rebecca says, is not fruitful or welcoming to a lot of people, right? Like, how do we advise students in those conversations in the hallway? Of course, there are ways of doing this more formally. Like, for example, having mid-semester feedback from students. Asking questions like, how comfortable do you feel about participating in class? What makes class participation difficult or easy for you? Is there anything we can do differently to make the space work for you as well? Right? So I would say a mix of the formal and informal kind of feedback.
Yes, certainly, Alan. I would agree that you need multiple strategies and multiple ways to put your finger on how things are working. And you're right, not everything is measurable. So Joyce, from the student perspective, what strategies have you experienced or have you seen implemented in a classroom that you thought worked really well, or that it really resonated with you?
Yeah, thank you. I think some of these things Dr. Haines-Saah and Dr. Martino might have already covered, but I think that one strategy that comes to mind right away is just establishing these expectations and boundaries right at the start of the semester and of the classes, and talking about having a safe space and a brave space. So having a safe space that people can come and interact and feel like their thoughts are welcome, and also being brave to be willing to share their experiences, because sometimes we might not know what a person is going through until we really hear their experience and learn more about their context. And to that end, also respecting dialogue and really talking about language and the use of language. I think that it's important to recognize that the classroom is a learning space and that we all come in with our different biases. And so having a respectful way to provide feedback when people might not be using language in the correct way and in a way that is inclusive and respectful of diversity. And I think that's one of the steps towards destigmatization and normalizing some certain aspects of language that we use that we might not necessarily think about. And I think that just thinking of my experience in the Health and Society program and the different courses that I had, I think that having these discussions about various issues and the different intersectional factors that are impacting people on a daily basis, I think that that really opened my eyes to see that there are certainly still issues in terms of inclusivity, and that's why we're still having this discussion here today, and there's still much to be done. I think that what those discussions brought for me was an opportunity to reflect and think about where my position is, and how I might be contributing and how I can help to make the classroom a more inclusive place, as well as in the future how I can work towards just being a more inclusive person in my daily life.
Thank you, Joyce. I think that's it's really unique to hear from a student perspective about what actually works. And I'm wondering if you have had any experience with things that maybe you felt didn't work very well. You could tell the instructor is trying to make an effort to be inclusive, but it just didn't resonate, or it just couldn't take off for whatever reason. Do you have any reflections on that?
I think that perhaps just comparing certain classes that I've had, I would think that the times when it didn't work very well was when there wasn't that initial establishment of the expectations and boundaries. So at times there might be a certain language used by students, and they are inadvertently using language that might not be particularly inclusive. And this, I don't think, was done intentionally, but since that those boundaries and expectations weren't set ahead of time, it might have been unclear for the students how they should be having the dialogue in a respectful way, because I absolutely believe we should be having these difficult conversations and having conversations that might lead to a little bit of discomfort, particularly if somebody is not used to hearing about certain topics, but at the same time, having it within a specific boundary as well.
Yeah, thank you, Joyce. And now to Rebecca and Alan. I know, building an inclusive classroom is hard work and it's very intentional. And as Joyce pointed out, sometimes it doesn't always go how we had planned. So I'm wondering if you can share any experiences with encountering challenges in building an inclusive classroom, maybe something you've tried that either flopped or just didn't go very well. And how did you regroup and recover from that? Maybe Alan, would you like to go first?
Yeah, and it's interesting when you ask this question about challenges that we have encountered when building, right? There are certain lessons learned that I had. Like one of the commitments that I try to make is I take responsibility in terms of engaging critical reflection about what I need to learn, but also unlearn. Like there's a lot of unlearning on our parts and structures that still also happens. So what I appreciate is students who, again, I think, Joyce, is to your point, I think creating that space from the start where students feel empowered to even speak, I think that makes a huge difference, because I've had students come to me at the end of the class and say, that activity really felt uncomfortable, but not uncomfortable in a productive way. Like, can we shift it? Can we change it? Right? For me, it's a lot about getting feedback from students who are incredibly amazing at sharing some of the ways in which activities might not go the way I think they will go. But there's also the other part of this challenge of building an inclusive classroom that is also structural. Like Rebecca was saying, as a person of color, especially, and queer person, I get invited to a lot of committees, right? Because then you're the diversity person in the committee, and it increases your work significantly. It increases, for example, the number of students that come to you for mentorship. So of course, I love, one of the things that I love the most in my job is having conversations with students, and when they feel comfortable enough to disclose kinds of experiences they have and challenges they have. But the challenge, of course, is that you're sometimes working twice as much, right, to engage in that kind of mentorship that is not always just about course content, but it's also about life decisions and very significant challenges. I just recently talked to a student who's debating whether or not they should disclose their disability, right, in publications. And we're kind of talking about some of the complexities in that decision, and it's not easy. So there's definitely that. I think there's also a culture of overwork that we live in this kind of neoliberal, space that goes both for faculty members, but for students as well. I remember as a PhD student, one time I was grabbing coffee with a friend of mine, taking a break from work, and this faculty member passes by and says, "Wow, you have time to take a break and drink coffee? You should be writing, you should be working." Like those messages don't help challenge the ways that we, think about productivity in the university today. And it just doesn't do well for students or for faculty members as well. I think the other thing too that we need to be thinking about is just the ways in which the education system in general still reproduces form of violence towards marginalized students, including disabled students, right? We still have lots of requirements in terms of documentation and diagnosis that students have to go through to get accommodations, right? It was very interesting during COVID, right? A lot of, accommodations that were seen as impossible or just unreasonable, now we're being done. We're often asked to be flexible, to give students more time, to be more patient with students. Something that to me should be done always, not only when we have a pandemic happening. right? So I think this should be a wake-up call in the ways that we're also reproducing violence to students with disabilities and marginalized students, and creating additional barriers. The last thing I'll say too, one of the challenges that I've definitely seen is students that unfortunately don't have the vocabulary to articulate their experiences. So I did a project with a colleague of mine at McMaster University where we interviewed teaching assistants and about how their social locations, social identities shape their experiences and interactions with students and faculties. What was interesting to us is that a lot of students, one, they didn't even know what the word intersectionality was. So if you don't have the vocabulary to articulate the things that you're experiencing, that you might think, oh, it's only me, or is it bad that I'm experiencing this, or should I complain about this, or is it not okay? When students don't have the vocabulary even to articulate these experiences, a lot of struggles go kind of on, under the radar. So I think that we need to listen to people. And one of my jobs, I think, as an instructor is to do my best to give people the vocabulary, right, to be able to articulate these experiences of advantages, disadvantages in life, and these complexities, right?
Thanks, Anna. That's a great point about the structures that we work within and how that can sometimes limit what we're able to do and how we have to fight against those structures very intentionally. Rebecca, how about you? Some challenges you faced that you'd like to maybe highlight today?
Yeah, just building on what Alan said and offering another part of the equation, I think I don't want to oversell that it's, for me, always about connecting and supporting. That is vital. But it is also about stepping in and intervening and sometimes, doing the thing that feels like redirecting or shutting down when there are things that can potentially be harmful or feel like violence in the classroom. And I'll share an example from my early days of teaching, which was really, formative for me. And that's in teaching women's health. And this is a mixed classroom. So I'm teaching health professionals, I'm teaching midwives, and I'm also teaching gender and sexuality studies majors at UBC. I had an all-woman classroom, and I allowed the groups for their group presentations, which were going to be, creative and arts-based and whatever they wanted to do, to select their own topics. And it got too far along when I realized one group was doing a topic that, was potentially very harmful and colonialist and would feel like violence to the Black African students in the classroom. And they were talking about female genital circumcision, but in a very, Western medical white-centered way. And so really had to intervene with that group in a way that felt pretty awful for me as a young instructor, and actually felt pretty hard for the group of midwives as well. And so we had to sit with that and challenge it. But ultimately there was, only one Black African student in the class, but they need to be protected and they couldn't be exposed to that group presentation, which directly spoke to their country of origin, right? So these are difficult situations, but they're also learning opportunities. And that's the space where you as the instructor really demonstrate the values that you hold and what you're willing to talk about and not talk about. But I also model that as a faculty member. When other researchers talk about researching Africans or being in Africa, it's a continent. There are many countries. And for me, with a family of African origin, that really also upsets me. So it's like what you model and you bring to all of your practices, to all of your relationships with folks and your colleagues. And then students also see that, and they see that you are living those values and they know what you stand for and what you don't.
Yeah, great. Yeah, just really highlighting that role of an educator as being that role model is so critical. Thank you, Rebecca. I'm going to go to a question that we have in the chat from Fiona, because I think it fits really well in the conversation we're having here about challenges. And so Fiona's question is around the friction point of safety in the classroom, from framing it also as being a space where students are evaluated for a grade. And grades are important to students because it sets up this is the system we work in, that if they want to continue on for a graduate program, professional programs, scholarships, competitive, if you're an undergraduate, summer studentships of research experiences, grades are important. And so this can set up a space where the instructor is being a critical thinker and evaluator of the students. So how are the panelists thinking about that or reconciling that different framing? And I think that refers to the framing of just, allowing students to be who they are and express themselves in different ways, but then having to then assess that.
I think the first thing that comes to my mind is about how can I create assignments or opportunities for students to take a risk, and do something differently, try a topic, but without feeling that they might be punished through grades. So it might be the amount of points that I assign to each assignment, right? So for example, when I try those arts-based projects, I know that for some people, for some students, it's terrifying because you have never done something like this. You never drew a comic strip before. But to me, it's about like the value that I add to it, but also an opportunity for students to self-evaluate and self-reflect. So I always add opportunities for them to reflect on their own process of doing that assignment. So as a way to balance my thinking, but also trying to think, how can I create a safety net where they feel they can take this risk, try this new assignment or new way of thinking without the fear of being punished by grades. The other thing too is I know it's time consuming and painful at times, but the more feedback that we can provide to students, the more they feel reassured about how they're navigating the process. Especially when you're doing something a little bit outside of the box, like you really need to provide students with more feedback, right? So they really understand how the process works. They don't feel as overwhelmed. And also they're more willing to take risks. So for example, I remember when I did this improvisation exercise in my classroom, right? So it's explain how the education system can be ableist sometimes. Like it was about how can I create a comfortable space for students to take this big risk of being in front of other peers and act, out of the blue. So it was really about breaking down those activities, giving them a chance to get warm, like in the first class, and then the second class, we might try something a little bit more challenging. Of course, this has a grade at the end of the day, and there's just so much I can do, but it's still creating those safety zones where students can get a sense of what they're doing and why.
Thanks, Alan. Rebecca, do you have anything to add, or Joyce, even from a student perspective, how you feel about assessment and how that may impact your how you feel, included or valued?
Sure. Yeah. I think that just adding on to Dr. Martino's point, I would say that having an established student culture within your classroom, where you know that you have a relationship with the instructor, where they are taking a posture of compassion and being caring and respectful to who you are as a person, and then having those discussions. And then through those discussions and through that learning in that classroom space, then you apply your learning into the assessment. I think that is one way that perhaps has worked, I would say, in some of the classroom environments that I have been in, because I can absolutely attest to the fact that grades are number one on students' minds when they're in the classroom. But I think that in the long run, the more important thing that you're getting out of the classroom is the lessons and the new knowledge that you're developing and the new perspectives that you're gaining in the class. That's what you carry forward with you. 10, 20, 30 years down the road, no one's going to care about my GPA, but the perspectives that I bring and the way that I interact with people and the types of language that I use is what's going to follow me.
Yeah, thanks, Joyce. Yeah, that's a real tension. Rebecca?
Yeah, those are great points from both. And I think to that, I would just add is that, if I'm teaching research methods, for example, there's certain, certain domains of knowledge and certain understandings of the literature that people need to bring to show that they've done the work and that they're proficient. How they apply that, if they're doing that thoroughly and they can, back up their claims, it's not up for me to agree necessarily with their positioning or the experience and the lens that they bring, as long as they are showing that they've been thoughtful about the work, then that's what they're assessed on, It's not about aligning views, and I make that clear to students from the outset, but it is about, using the tools I'm providing to think critically about the material. And within that domain, you have the license to also bring your lived experience and to challenge the material and also to challenge me. And many times, especially teaching undergraduates, they don't feel that they have that space.
Great, thank you.
Just
So I'm going to, did you want to add something, Alan?
I just wanted to add something to Rebecca's point too. It's very interesting, this question of challenging too, right? And especially challenging faculty members. It's, I always invite students to challenge me. And I think that's such a great exercise, and challenging the readings and really doing critical thinking, right? I think the other interesting thing is we're talking about inclusive classroom and intersectionality is also the piece around when faculty members are challenged in problematic ways too, right? Like we're not seen as knowers. Like I had, and I've spoken with other, colleagues as well, like where our knowledge is not considered to be as legitimate by students or gets questioned, right? Because sometimes you're speaking about something like race or disability or something, and then you get kind of framed as just an angry person of color or just an angry disabled person, right? So I think there's some also interesting moments in that question around challenging, just another twist to it, I guess.
Certainly something to be mindful of. I think this discussion leads nicely into another question in the chat from Joanna, and really around this idea of students' responsibility to share. So we have been talking about, making students comfortable, giving them a safe space where they can share. So what about students who don't want to or are not comfortable sharing? How does their learning become impacted in that kind of an environment? And so any of the three of you who want to jump in here? Rebecca?
Well, I think it's important to remember that, these things are voluntary, and it's about building capacity and recognizing that there's certain reasons why people tend to over participate in class and who's able to take up space, whose voices dominate, and then drawing out those other voices. Those are things we learn to navigate early on as instructors and to mediate and ways to draw people out. But also thinking thoughtfully around assessment and assignment so that there are ways for people to participate that don't involve maybe doing that in the classroom, and disclosure. So if you have other ways of critical reflecting through reflection papers or other assignments where people can do it through that lens, then I think that provides opportunity. But ultimately, like, there are students who come through some of the courses that don't afford themselves of that. And that's also fine. I mean, that's who they are and that's what they're doing. But I think they take away from it, an acceptance of people bringing also personal experience to knowledge, and that we are not just, deliverers of content and reiterating textbook principles and practices.
Yeah, and I would agree 100% with Rebecca. I think the only thing what I could add is that we need to be thinking about participation and ways of articulating ideas more creatively, right? And more broadly. So for me, it's about giving students multiple ways of doing that. It might be passing Post-it notes, like if you have any questions and you don't feel like asking to everyone, just pass it on in front and we'll address those. It's about emails. Like I do count, like if someone says, like 3 hours after class, because some students do need time to reflect. Like we're talking about topics that sometimes require a lot of rethinking what you thought your entire life. I myself, for example, I know that my way of thinking takes time. I need to make those connections in my head before I can speak in class. So have even giving those times of saying, if you have something that comes to your mind, like 5 hours after class, just send me an email and we can, exchange a couple of emails and talk about those two. To me, that also counts as participation. Or I had one student who really didn't feel comfortable participating in class. And then what we kind of found as the most interesting way is that she really wanted to do a podcast. She was like, I can do like a 15-minute podcast with like 5 episodes, really speaking about the class content, and I'll be very comfortable. I'll be doing from my room, wearing something that's very comfortable for me, and to me, that also is amazing. The last thing I'll just share here too, one of the amazing things that I love about attending the Canadian Disability Studies Association meeting every year is that they put so much emphasis on different ways of using space. So for example, in that conference, you're going to just see people moving around if that's what they want to do, if their body is telling to do that, right? People who lie down on the floor, if that's the position where they feel comfortable to learn and their bodies feel more comfortable. So I think that how amazing would it be to have more spaces like this? And I've seen cases of people in high schools, for example, that have bikes at the back of the class. So you can take a break and, ride your bike as you're learning. So there are ways that we can change the classroom space too. So the last thing I'll say, I swear, this is the last, it's also when we think about accommodations, for example, right? We often think about it as an individual action or an individual issue, right? It's like, let me do something for this one student and that's it. But I think those requests invite us to rethink how we can organize the classroom, how we can organize the way we do teaching, which there are other ways of doing that. So that's what I would do. Like for me, is how can we transform the classroom as a space rather than only thinking about individuals and waiting for those accommodation letters to come in our mailbox? And honestly, like some things can be done differently and it doesn't cost us more. It doesn't take us 3 hours more of teaching prep. It can be something as simple as when at the CDSA conference that I just mentioned, they have different colors, right, of buttons. And depending on how you're feeling about engaging with others today, it's a different color. So if I'm really wanting to participate and engage, I'll wear green. If I'm really like, I just want to be here on my corner and listen, just wear red. Like it doesn't take much, right, to change the ways we do things. And I swear that was the last thing.
Thanks, Alan. Joyce, anything you wanted to add to that? We can move on if you don't.
Yeah, I'd be happy to if there's still time. So I really loved the point that Dr. Martino made about just having different ways for students to be able to interact and participate in classes. And it might not always look the same, but it's a way that opens up opportunities for people to participate in a way that they feel comfortable. I think that's something that I've also seen not only within a class in particular, but also over the years as I've moved with my cohort in my program, was just seeing how people became more and more comfortable as time progressed in being willing to share their views and their opinions. And I think that the classrooms that really helped to encourage that were the ones where people could bounce ideas off of each other. And as Dr. Haines-Saah mentioned, sometimes there can be some domination, I guess, over the conversation if there's only certain people who are participating. But I think that over time, if everyone is encouraged to participate and to share their views, that people can become more and more comfortable. And sometimes it takes just a little bit of pushing yourself, not in a way that is like too difficult, but also being willing to take risks, I would say.
Yeah, thank you, Joyce. And to me, this conversation around different ways of expression, different ways of participating really brings to mind the principles that underlie the universal design for learning. And that's an approach that really, like Alan says, really challenges us to think about our classrooms as being not just socially inclusive, but physically inclusive, and almost tries to do away with having to have accommodations because everyone's learning is already facilitated. And so that's a great resource there, the Universal Design for Learning. And I know that those links have been sent around. But I'd like to hear from Rebecca and Alan if you have any great resources that you leverage for inspiration when you are thinking about your classroom and inclusivity in that context. I know Rebecca already mentioned Bell Hook's Teaching to Transgress, which I've heard from before, which is a great book. Rebecca?
Yeah, that book's from 1994, so I would encourage folks to read it. I mean, one of the ways that I really do continue to learn, the greatest resource is students, actually. Students that I follow on social media, the conversations from graduate students around me, and I work with student activist groups as well, like nationally, who are working as advocates and graduate students at the same time for changes to drug policy. So I think being connected to students, what issues are central to them. Sometimes it's a generational issue when students are younger, but we also have adult students who are parents and are coming in at different phases in their lives and careers. So, I mean, that's very general, but that's where I learned the most. For example, at UBC, when I was teaching women's health, you know, it was many years ago, but that's where I first learned about the scholarship around fat phobia. And it's not something that I had learned in my training to that point because it was fairly new at that time. And it really opened my mind and I incorporated that into my syllabus. So.
No, that's great. Ellen, any resources you'd like to share?
Well, it's interesting. For me, it's really, I always realize how much more I have to learn and how much more critical thinking about, you know, what does it mean to be me, you know, navigating classes and interactions with students and other faculty members. All that takes a lot of reflection, but I do see the classroom as this potentially very transformative space. Like I've seen students really transform their way of thinking, the ways that they see their lives and families, like the ways that they make decisions. Like I had a student one time that talked about like, should I vaccine my child? You know, and we had this whole dialogue from a critical disability studies lens. So it can be very transformative. It can really be concrete and have very concrete consequences. To me, very similar to Rebecca, I'm very lucky to have an amazing network of colleagues in disability studies. Joanna's here, for example, who I can brainstorm. I can have ideas. I learn so much about how they are teaching as well, right? They're always challenging me to think differently, to try different assignments, to try doing those assignments differently. And the same way I share those resources with people. So it's like this nice database of cool ideas that we get to share with each other. Unfortunately, because of COVID, we don't have hallways conversations, but we still have those communities, even virtually. It's about students. Like there are so many amazing students here at EFC who are doing amazing advocacy work. Like they know what the challenges are in navigating the campus, both physically, emotionally, culturally, like people know their lived experiences. So they bring those to the classroom if you allow them to bring those to the classroom. And of course, the challenge, and I always articulate that to students, is how do you move from an individual lens, right? Which we all understand our lived experiences, but how do we put it back to like cultural, much broader picture? That is a challenge here, right? How do we see connections? How do we see how the work we do here is connected with activist work outside of university? So to me, these conversations with colleagues and students are like an amazing resource, but also learning. So I would highly invite folks here to look into disability studies in education. Here's a field that is talking about not inclusion, right? But much more than that. Like inclusion is not enough. Like it's about actually rethinking who counts as a good student, who counts as a normal student, who counts as the students we expect to have in the classroom. Can we expect disability in our classes? Can we expect to do, teaching differently just because that's how it should be? Can we expect to encounter difference and to treat difference in a productive way, in a way that is welcomed in the classroom? So that's some of the insights that I've learned from scholars in this field who are having these conversations and trying to think about not just ways that we tweak the system or tweak things, but how can we be more radical and really challenge the ways we do things? understanding that we have constraints that we'll never be able to escape, or at least for some time. But I do appreciate the more radical thinking as well, right? They move us forward.
Thank you, Alan. And I'd like to give the last word to our student panelist, Joyce. So as instructors and educators move forward in thinking about creating these inclusive learning spaces, what, from a student perspective, do you think they need to keep in mind?
Yeah, I would just start off by saying that I really hope that one day we can think of inclusive as being the new normal, where we don't have to necessarily think of like how are we making things accessible, because they already are, kind of like what we've discussed so far today. So I think that one of the thoughts that came to mind just as Dr. Haines-Saah and Dr. Martino were speaking were just the idea of coming in as an instructor or a professor or the person leading the classroom as a learner still, and acknowledging that and recognizing that in front of students so that they are also aware that this is not something that has an endpoint, that we continue to learn, and also acknowledging if we're making mistakes as instructors or even as students. If students make a mistake, then to respectfully correct them, and allowing that dialogue vice versa as well. Understanding that there is a difference in the level of authority, I would say, but still knowing that that the instructor is open to that as long as it's in a respectful manner. And yeah, just regularly asking students for feedback, I think, and recognizing that this is a continual process. It's not something where we just receive evaluation at the end and then we talk about how we can improve for the next year, but regularly doing check-ins one-on-one or anonymously or however you do it, so that we can continue to modify and continue to build more inclusive classrooms.
Great, wonderful. So I see that we are just at the end of our time. So I just really want to take this opportunity to thank our panel members, Alan, Rebecca, and Joyce, for your very thoughtful comments, for your candid expressions, and I think for the challenges that you've kind of put to other educators about thinking about inclusivity as being rethinking how we teach and not just adding a little thing here and there. So I think that's really quite vital. I want to thank Mariko Rowe and Liz Live for helping us get organized, and of course everyone today who participated in the panel discussion or was here to listen. If you have any questions, please feel free to email myself or one of our panelists, and I'm happy to pass along questions to our panelists if you'd like further discussion with that. But with that, I will say have a fantastic Friday and enjoy your weekend, and see you all at the next seminar. Thank you.